When it comes to creating video games, a lot of developers have many ideas when trying to create the perfect franchise. A lot of big AAA studios try to make a game every couple of years, and most of the time, they just are lazy with the games they release. All they are thinking about is how much money can we squeeze out of our players. But when a game does well, the developers usually go two ways. They either take their time and make an amazing sequel that will be highly praised above their previous entry, or they try to scramble and create a sequel to try to profit off of the first game. So today we will be covering some of the worst game sequels of all time, and these are in any specific order. Keep in mind that this does not make them bad games, they were just disappointing and not on the same level as their previous entry. Assassin's Creed Liberation was actually a console exclusive for many years. It was a PS Vita exclusive, and that was the only place you could play it at the time. Years later, back in 2014, the game was ported over to newer consoles and PC, but it did not live up to the hype people were expecting it to. It is not a bad game by any means, but it just was a mediocre Assassin's Creed title. It did some pretty unique things like the special outfit system. This allowed you to throw on different disguises to allow you to get past certain areas. There was the slave disguise, the lady disguise, and the assassin disguise. Each one played a pretty important role in the gameplay loop. The story itself was pretty mediocre, and the story is what makes an Assassin's Creed game so good. The game is technically a spin-off of Assassin's Creed 3, and that game was incredible. So the people who wanted more of the AC3 were let down by Liberation. It is worth playing if you want to play all the Assassin's Creed games, just don't expect much from it.
I watched as these colonist scum stole everything from me.
As a standalone title, Red Faction Armageddon really isn't a bad game, but when you compare it to its predecessor, Red Faction Guerrilla, it's a major step down in quality. In Red Faction Guerrilla, you had a very large open world, huge buildings to destroy, and lots of fun weapons, and many other features that just made it really fun to play. The story really takes a back seat to the gameplay, and it was better off doing that. It has issues of its own, but it still managed to become a game that many people, including myself, have fond memories of. But then you have Red Faction Armageddon, a game that was much more like the original and second Red Faction games. Even though it was a return to its previous form, most fans of the series had been drawn in by playing Guerrilla, and going back to a linear, more story-focused gameplay was incredibly disappointing. There are still fans of the original games who disagree, but the developers ending the series with Armageddon is pretty telling of the reception of it, and it was quite obvious they knew Red Faction Guerrilla was the fan favorite, as they released a remaster of the game a few years ago. While it may not be the worst game in the world, it drastically fell short as a sequel.
On deck. Welcome to Crackdown III, the only game built like me.
Leading up to the release of Crackdown 3, the media coverage and hype for the game were pretty insane. I remember seeing those Terry Crews commercials and just thinking how cool it was that he was the main character of the game. I mean, to be completely honest, the game is fun in a lot of ways, and it's not like you can't pick up the game on sale and have a good time with it. I think the main issue was that it wasn't anything groundbreaking, and at the time people were expecting something much better than what was actually offered. It felt half-baked and released too early, which I know we hear a lot, but it's unfortunately the case for this game. The gameplay can be very repetitive and stale, and some of the dialogue, like the humor in particular, can come out pretty generic at times. I also think that the original Crackdown game in particular has so much nostalgia associated with it. Even though the game was pretty simple in nature, it was just one of those nostalgic games people remembered playing on the Xbox 360. And Crackdown 3 was supposed to live up to that, but never quite hit the mark. It's honestly not the worst game ever, it's still fun, it just wasn't the sequel fans of the series were looking for.
Commanding officer at Way Station Romeo. They began reacting to bright light.
Dead Space 3 is considered the worst Dead Space game out of the three. As the games go on, the community seemed to not enjoy the games as much because of the weird story changes that the developers made. Dead Space 1 and 2 are considered incredible games and each have their own unique mechanics they experimented with. But with 3, the developers went for a more action-oriented game that people didn't want. The first two games were more horror focused, and that is what the community enjoyed so much about them. The third game had a lot of action set pieces that weren't really necessary, and the characters, according to the community, are extremely dreadful to play as. The story itself was extremely boring and was the worst aspect of the game. It also didn't add anything new to the formula like the previous entries. There are some people who enjoy the game, and it's not necessarily bad, but compared to Dead Space 1 and 2, it definitely is not comparable.
The original Force Unleashed game is probably one of the best Star Wars games of all time. Even though it's not canon, the hack and slash gameplay while playing as a Sith is an amazing experience. When The Force Unleashed 2 was released, I was extremely excited to play it, but then, even as a kid with low standards, I could sense that there was just something off about it. The combat felt off, the story was confusing and weird, and overall I lost interest and really never touched the game again. To me, the best thing about the game was the ability to chop off stormtrooper limbs or even slice them in half, but even that wasn't enough to keep me playing. There are still fans of this game, but the vast majority think that the game is a disappointing follow-up to an amazing game. It seems like the studio didn't even know why the original was so popular, and they strayed far from the quality that the previous game had. Overall, it just lacked the substance and the character that The Force Unleashed 1 had, but on its own, it's simply an average Star Wars game at best.
It's been some time since Vault 76 opened its door.
I don't think Fallout 76 was or is a bad game. There's a solid community for the game, and people who play and invest in it really enjoy playing it. The unfortunate thing is that this game released after Fallout 4, which, no matter what they did, that's a very high bar to live up to. People were expecting another game similar to Fallout 4, but when the format was announced, people were already worried about the release of the game. Then, when the game actually released, people already had their expectations, and the game suffered because of that. The game is much better now, but when the game was released, it was incredibly grindy, and there were no NPCs in the game. They added NPCs into the game with the Wastelanders edition, but just to think that they released a game to the community with no NPCs and only user interaction blows my mind. It just wasn't an appealing release for that community. The game has come a long way since, but it's still viewed as a disappointment in the franchise and never quite lived up to being the sequel people wanted.
Resident Evil 6 is considered the worst Resident Evil in the entire franchise, and there are over 30 Resident Evil games including main games, spin-offs, and remakes. It is extremely long and drawn out compared to the other games, and the story has a ton of fluff. The main reason why people didn't like it is that the game took itself way too seriously. The Resident Evil games have always had a sort of parody to it, but with Resident Evil 6 they went all in on the craziness and it ended up being too much for what the game is. It suffers from the same thing that Dead Space 3 suffers from. It strayed too far from the path of the other games in the series, and that is what drove people away from it. It is crazy that the next game in the series was Resident Evil 7, and that is one of our favorite horror games of all time. It just took a bit of time and thought to make a great game. But with Resident Evil 6, the developers wanted to go all out, and that is not what the community wanted from a Resident Evil game.
After the huge success in Metal Gear Solid 5, more fans than ever were interested in the Metal Gear series. Then, Metal Gear Survive was released, and the odd thing is that it seemed like they didn't really attempt to market this game at all. The game seemed to pop up on random YouTube channels that made fun of it and showed off how horribly dull the gameplay was. They pretty much just reused assets from Metal Gear Solid 5, threw zombies into it, and slapped on the title Survive, which honestly was just a poor attempt at cashing in on the zombie survival genre. Players looking for an innovative stealth game like 5 would have to look somewhere else. Or they could play this game and use poles to poke at zombies through fences. It's baffling that any large studio would release a game in this state, and once again, it's a clear case of studios not knowing their audience. The game is pretty dead, and it's largely been forgotten at this point, but what hasn't been forgotten is how it's one of the worst sequels ever.
Enemy forces are being deployed to secure it.
Battlefield 2042 was released after Battlefield 5 and Battlefield 1. Although Battlefield 5 wasn't greatly received at first, the community was not prepared for what Battlefield 2042 turned out to be. Lots of multiplayer games come out with base content and improve over time, like Battlefield 5. But Battlefield 2042 was expected to have some of the basic Battlefield features that all games in the series feature. One of the more noticeable features that was missing in Battlefield 2042 at launch was the destruction. Battlefield games have always been known for their crazy set pieces within the maps. I think back to Battlefield 4 and how great that game's destruction was, and that came out over a decade ago. The game also didn't release with a single player story mode, had no leaderboards at launch, operator configurations that just didn't mesh with a player base, and of course, the bugs and optimization issues at launch. The game had been sitting at mostly negative on Steam, but now it sits at mixed, which still isn't great. Although the game is much better now, it was a disappointment at launch and considered a terrible sequel to the installments before it.
All the games on this list aren't bad because we did enjoy our time with a few of them, but to enjoy them, we definitely had to overlook a lot of negative things about them. Sequels to games that are highly regarded are usually going to come out, but it all depends on the developer and how they handle it. If they want more money, then the game will most likely be bad. That's not always the case though, as there are a ton of game sequels that are absolutely incredible. Just do your research before playing a franchise to see what game you want to skip, unless you want to push through all of them. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like. Also consider subscribing if you like our content. We also have a gaming podcast called Cast where we talk about anything gaming related. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.